Okay, let's look at fractions and division, dividing a fraction by a whole number. Although everybody groaned today when I said, hey, we're going to do some division of fractions, we got some good news because when we divide fractions, we actually get to multiply to find the quotient, which seems odd, but we're going to talk about why. First, let's review multiplication of fractions. When we multiply fractions, like 1/3 times 4/5, 1/3 times 4/5, we don't have to have common denominators or anything. We just simply multiply our numerators. 1 times 4 equals 4 is our numerator. And then we look at our denominators. 3 times 5 is 15. So the product of 1/3 and 4/5 is 4/15. So when you know how to do that, you can actually divide. We said, hey, why is it that, well, maybe in this kind of problem you can't see, but if we did 1/3 of 1/3, we would get 1 times 1 is 1, 3 times 3 is 9. Why is it that the product of two fractions is smaller than either of my factors? Because 1/9 is smaller than 1/3. Why is that? Because fractions themselves are division. So when we multiply two fractions, we're actually dividing. So that's why our product is smaller, because these are fractions. So since we know that, we talked about a thing. Let me erase all this, make some room here. We talked about the word inverse. We talked about inverse operations. The inverse is the opposite. The inverse for addition is subtraction. The inverse for multiplication is division, and that goes both ways. The inverse for division is multiplication. The inverse for subtraction is addition. So if we know that multiplication and division are inverse operations, and we talked about when we multiply, we're actually dividing fractions, what happens if I need to divide 1/3, say, by 4? What if I was trying to divide 1/3? 1/3 divided by 4. Well, I can't do a problem like this. This won't work. Nope, because we have fractions here. Since we know that fractions are division and we are trying to divide this, then we multiply, we're actually dividing. What we're going to do is we're going to take the inverse here. We're going to say, hey, we can multiply the inverse, and that's going to be division. So we take 1/3, and we're going to get the inverse for 4. Let me simplify this here. Let me clear my board. We're doing 1/3 divided by 4. 1/3 divided by 4. We said, hey, I need to get an inverse. What is the inverse of 4? Well, 4 in itself is a fraction 4/1. So I'm going to get the inverse by flipping this. And I say, what is the inverse of 4? Then it's 1/4 is my inverse. This is the inverse of 4. So I'm going to flip that number around and I get 1/4. Once I have my inverse number, I can multiply the factor here by the inverse, and that is actually dividing by 4. So 1/3 times 1/4, and I take my numerators, 1 times 1 equals 1, and 3 times 4 equals 12, and the product here is actually my quotient, because to divide, we take the inverse and multiply, and this is the answer for 1/3 divided by 4. So we can see another example here. Remember how to find an inverse here. And if you take the inverse and multiply it, you're dividing a fraction. So let's take 1/4 divided by 3. We're going to divide 1/4 into 3 parts. Well, Remember, I'm going to take this and get the inverse. What is the inverse of 3? 1/3. So now I can multiply 1/4 times 1/3. 1 times 1 is 1. 4 times 3 is 12. So the quotient here, 1/4 divided by 3, is 1/12. You multiply times the inverse, and that's how you find your quotient.